what is your perception of Black Lives Matter and the fact that so many white Americans have joined in with that to saying all lives can't matter until Black lives matter, and white silence is equivalent to violence. And then we see people protesting all over the world for justice for George Floyd and African Americans.
I think that I'm always very careful, especially as a pastor, not to bind myself with something that may or may not ultimately reach our stated goal. So we all say that Black Lives Matter. We believe that. But what is the foundation of the organization? So I'm trying to be a little bit diplomatic here, Kelly, for lack of a better term. But some of the underlying themes of Black Lives Matter doesn't line up, I think, not only with the message that I present as a pastor and a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ, but also they are like, for instance, one of the founders openly recently said that they're Marxists, they're trained Marxists. And so I'm not a proponent of Marxism. I think it's counterproductive to not only this nation, but the needs of the African American community. And so although we can agree that everyone should be treated equally and fairly as human beings, you won't see me with a Black Lives Matter t-shirt on. Again, I'm not anti anything. I'm just trying to promote the ideas and the agenda that I think is beneficial to the African American community and to the nation as a whole. And so reconciliation is a theme that we all should come together on. And treating everyone equally. That's the golden rule, right, Kelly? Love your neighbor as yourself. And so I think that those are things that I like to focus on more so. And sometimes some of these factions don't line up completely with, some of the agendas that we're promoting.
So on Sunday morning, when you have to talk to members of your congregation, or through the week when you're having these discussions, and people are asking, what do we do? How do we reconcile? And how do we get across this impasse and repair the breach that's been broken between police and the Black community, between whites and Blacks and First Nations people, the Native Americans? What's your message for reconciliation and bringing a healing balm to each and every one of us?
Well, the first thing, as I stated, we have to have open and honest conversations from a historical basis and a factual basis. But the other part of that is to rightly define terms. And I've done a lot of that recently. I think that a lot of times we kind of miss the opportunity to grow when we don't properly identify terms. So a lot of people are painting this broad stroke of racism, everything is racism. But there's a difference between racism, bigotry, bias, and prejudice, right? So racism is systematic and it's institutional. And we've done a lot in this country to overcome racism through laws. So prime example, Kelly, in the 1950s, when you had Jim Crow, you had certain laws, discriminatory laws. A restaurant could have had a sign up that said no Blacks allowed, right? I walk into the restaurant, they call the sheriff comes and arrests me, right? That's systematic, that's institutional. After the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and some of the other civil rights legislation that makes it illegal to discriminate against people based on race and ethnicity and skin color, I can walk into that same restaurant. If they deny me service based on the color of my skin, I can call the sheriff and now that person is in trouble. That's how you combat racism. It's systematic, it's institutional. What we deal with a lot in the message of the gospel is the perfect remedy for that is bigotry and bias are internal and they're individual. Right? We can't change the hearts of people based on laws and legislation, but you can change it based on the message of the gospel, which says that everyone is made in God's image and likeness. Out of one blood, he created us all, right? Every tribe and every tongue will come together. That's God's plan and purpose. And so the message of the gospel, while we are having these historical conversations, right, talking about the racism, and even the disparities in the economic systems and the school, educational systems in the urban areas and all those things, we also have to make sure that our ultimate goal is to try to fulfill God's purpose and plan, which is for us all to come together, to love each other, to value each other, and to learn of each other, because cultural differences a lot of times causes a division. And so when we begin to learn of each other, it helps to bring us together in the spirit of unity and the bond of peace.
And we should not be afraid to talk to any man
Absolutely.
in order to build some sort of relationship and break through this division that we have. And in the dialogue at that table, we might discover this thing called brotherhood. But it takes that, like you said, to have that dialogue. So I agree with you 100% on that. In fact, the National Black Church Initiative has also stated, why can't Black leaders in the Congressional Black Caucus and throughout the country sit down and talk to the president, and the president talk to them in an open, honest dialogue where you put it all on the table, regardless of how we be castigated as being maybe in a situation like Steve Harvey and Kanye West went through. But the point is, we got to come to the table, because
Absolutely.
we're at a point now that I believe we're at a tipping point that some people are very fearful of what the future holds. Will we get into more acts of violence between blacks and whites? And that's something this country cannot afford to go through.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. And I would just say that I think one of the bigger problems that I've seen is in politics, in the political realm. We have such divisiveness between Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, and all those type of divisions. And, you know, Kelly, we have to be, our goal has to be to make this country, you know, to heal this country and to move this country forward. We can't put identity politics and partisan politics over our desire to help, you know, these situations, because like you said, we got to get this right. You know, we have a great opportunity. I think that, you know, like the scripture says, what the enemy means for evil, God's can turn to good, but we have to participate in that. We have to move in accordance to that opportunity, that now that the people are having the conversation. A lot of people didn't have that conversation before, but now it seems like almost everyone is open to have that conversation, and we need to take advantage of that.
I wanted to ask you about the coronavirus spread, the fact that we're seeing it surge. And you were very adamant before Georgia reopened about the consequences of reopening too soon. In Georgia and Texas and Florida and Arizona in particular have seen a surge in cases. And this is something you had warned the governor about. Where do you stand on this now? I know you were dissatisfied with the actions then. Where do you stand now, knowing that if we don't do something about these reopenings, we may see an increase, a steady climb in coronavirus cases?
Well, here in DeKalb, we're seeing it. I was dissatisfied then, Kelly, and I'm still dissatisfied now with the governor's decision, but I'm also dissatisfied with those of us who fail to understand the severity of what it is we are dealing with. Just because a person opens the floodgates and say, hey, come on in, may not be the best place for you to go. As it relates to, you know, we had the conversation concerning, you know, of course, as a municipality here in DeKalb, we cannot create or hold an individual to a higher standard than has been established by the governor. So because there is no requirement for mandatory masks in public spaces, DeKalb County can make the request, but we cannot hold individuals to that particular degree. We are seeing a spike. But one of the things that's interesting, because during our last conversation, what the data had shown was that the bulk of the presence of known COVID-19 cases were in our Black and Brown communities, with the highest concentrations of African Americans on the eastern and the south unincorporated side. But now we're seeing a shift. We've had extreme, now the 30038 in which I live is not in the top 5. Seeing the northern part of DeKalb, which has the highest concentration of Caucasian residents, with the highest cases, as well as Tucker and Doraville. So I don't know where the disconnect comes as it relates to the severity. Just yesterday at New Birth Church, and I'd like to give Pastor Jamal Bryant, Elder Stokes, and that entire church family my warmest sentiments. Over 1,800 free tests were conducted. As we continue testing, we're going to continue to see a sharp rise. because many of us have just honestly failed to shelter in place, protect ourselves and those around us. So there's critical concerns there, and I urge everyone that may be a part of this conversation to understand the severity of what we're dealing with. Just because it's now sunny outside, we cannot go back to business as usual and conduct ourselves as we once have. Our lives are forever changed, Kelly.
Yeah, and it seems the sooner we awaken to that fact, the more lives we can save and mitigate the spread of this virus. And like Dr. Anthony Fauci and you have attested to before, wear a mask.
Wear a mask.
One of the simplest things to do. We are seeing some changes in terms of how police conduct themselves. In Virginia, for example, it's been announced that they will start, that every police officer in Virginia will, when they engage in a stop, they will have to ask that individual to identify their race. That way they're able to take an accounting rather, of how much of an exchange and interchange they have with all races. And then we can have a track record of what's going on in terms of how they treat Black Americans and for that matter, anyone.
I mean, that's a good start. There are a lot of good efforts in Sacramento, California. A dear friend and former business colleague is on the city council here, Alan Warren. And Alan Warren introduced an idea to have law enforcement make sure they have business cards with all their identifying information on them anytime they encounter the public in any kind of a police call. So the first thing they should do is identify themselves to make sure that a record is established. What you're talking about, Kelly, is what is necessary to be able to provide us with the analytics, to provide us with the data, to be able to prove a pattern and a practice. The law requires that we prove a pattern and a practice in order to be able to stop certain kinds of conduct. And these efforts will help us do that. Now, are they a replacement for ferreting out bad officers? No. Are they a replacement for reforming police departments and law enforcement agencies? No. But these are incremental steps that will be important in building a record that hopefully we can take before a judge and jury and get justice for our community.